What if a righteous man lost everything? Children, wealth, health, friends. What if even God seemed to have been silent? Satan stands up and says he only serves you because everything is going well. In a single day, everything falls apart. The house falls, grief arrives, pain screams. Accused by those who should console him, Job remains. He does not curse God. In the ashes of humiliation, with words mingled with pain and cry, Job lifts up his voice. And this cry crosses the centuries, like a song full of lament, hope, reverence, and faith. Today, you will know the complete story of the Book of Job in a way that you may have never seen, without filters and without fluff. This is a story that speaks of integrity in the midst of trial, of silence that screams louder than words, of pain that turns to reverence, and of the lordship of Christ that reveals itself even when all seems lost. If you stay until the end, I'm sure something will change inside you. In the vast land of Uz, under the scorching sky of the east, there lived a man who was blameless. His name was Job. He was upright, righteous, feared God, and shunned evil. His life was a living testimony of humility and justice. The reputation of his piety echoed like a song among the men of his generation. There was no fault in him, no shadow, but it was just this man that God allowed to be tested. And that's where the story really begins. A man named Job. He had everything anyone of the time could dream of. Healthy children, land, flocks, servants, and most importantly, he was known as upright before God and men. But in the blink of an eye, everything fell apart. He lost his children, he lost his assets, he lost his health. And yet, do you know what he did? He knelt down and said, "The Lord gave, the Lord took. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Can you imagine that? Someone losing everything and still praising. Now, if it were with us, let's be honest, most would have already dropped everything. He would have cried out, murmuring, "God, why me?" But Job did not. He maintained a reverence that frightens, because his pain was not light, it was one of those that need inside. Only those who have buried a child understand. Only those who have seen everything they built turn to dust recognize what this man went through. And yet, he did not revolt. This is true humility. It is when the soul is naked, broken, but still decides to trust in the lordship of Christ. And look how interesting. It wasn't even his fault. There was no hidden sin. It was no punishment. The trial came for a much greater reason, a conversation back in heaven between God and Satan. Yes, a kind of cosmic confrontation, where Satan said, "Job is only faithful because the Lord blesses him." And God allowed the test, but with limits. It makes me think how many times we go through struggles and don't even imagine that there is something bigger happening behind it. Sometimes God's silence is because heaven is watching our response. It's as if our every attitude echoes up there. Have you ever tried to worship in the midst of pain? Have you ever talked to God without feeling anything, without hearing anything, just to keep believing? It's like Job. He prayed, and the sky in silence. There was no voice, no relief, no vision, only pain, but he didn't give up. There is something in this silence that shapes us, that transforms, that reveals the truth about who we are. Integrity is not ever falling. It's to keep standing when everything around you tells you to lie down and give up. And Job, even covered with wounds, preferred integrity to empty outburst. I remember an acquaintance who went through something similar. He didn't lose everything at once, but he lost it little by little. First the job, then the marriage, then the father. One day he said to me, "I only have faith because I clung to it when there was nothing left." And that's it. Real faith is born in lament. Divine justice is not about deserving. It's about trusting even when it feels unfair. Job didn't understand anything, but he didn't stop believing. This is the hope that no one can steal, because it is born where logic dies. The beautiful thing is that Job was not perfect. He cried, he questioned it, he lamented, he wanted to understand. But do you know what he didn't do? He did not turn his back on God. That's it. That's what changes everything. Faith that resists pain is like gold in fire, purified, and his pain was the oven. Sometimes we think that faith is only when we feel it, but true faith is when we don't feel anything and still choose to believe. That's what integrity is all about. Keeping the faith with tears on your face. Now imagine the scene. Job sitting in the ashes, scratching himself with a shard of tile. His friends arrive, look at him and don't even recognize him. Such was the pain. And yet, he does not curse. He does not explode. He does not rebel. He just loves it. Can you see that? This is reverence. This is knowing that God continues to be God, even when everything around him seems otherwise. And sometimes it's that kind of quiet faith that changes destinies, that paves the way for restoration. And here comes the question that does not want to be silenced. What will God do with a faith like this? Could it be that a trust that does not depend on blessings does not deserve a response to match? Because if there is something that Job teaches us, it is that those who remain faithful in the valley will soon see the Redeemer on the top of the mountain. And it is at this point that the story begins to take an even deeper turn. Now listen to me carefully, because here the business starts to get deeper. What happens to Job does not begin on earth, it starts there in heaven. In one of those moments that we would never imagine, Satan appears before God. Yes, that's right. And God asks, "Where do you come from?" And the devil answers, "To go around the earth and walk about it." Job 1:7. Have you ever thought about it? The enemy circling the world, watching, looking for someone to touch. And then God, look at that. God is the one who mentions Job. It is he who says, "Hast thou beheld my servant Job? A man of integrity, righteous, fearing God and shunning evil." Job 1:8. It seems strange, right? God pointing to Job as an example just before the trial. But there's something important here. God knew Job's heart. He knew his faith, his integrity. I knew that his heart was not in the blessings, but in the Lord. And then Satan counters, "Of course, he only loves you because he has everything. Take away what he has, and you will see if he does not blaspheme you." Job 1:9-11. Look at the level of the accusation. It's as if the enemy is saying, this faith is a facade. And God allows the test, not to destroy Job, but to reveal what he carried inside. And here lies the mystery. Why would God allow this? Because, my friend, there are battles that only reveal our strength when we are thrown into the middle of war. Job's trial was not a punishment. It was a platform to expose what is most valuable, genuine faith. And that's why sometimes we go through fire. It's not to burn us. It's to taste the gold that is in us. The trial of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, is a matter of praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. 1 Peter 1:7. You know that moment when everything seems to fall apart and you ask yourself, why me? It may be exactly the instant when heaven is showing all hell that your faith is not for sale, that you don't worship God for blessings, but for presence. This is the cosmic confrontation, the invisible battle between deception and truth. And the name of our faith is at stake. Job didn't even know what was going on up there, but what he did down here became an answer to silence Satan. Right, that's powerful. There's a phrase I often say, your pain may be telling a story that the whole spirit world is watching. And in this case, it was exactly that. Satan wanted to prove that Job's faithfulness was self-serving, but God knew otherwise. And that's why he allowed the test. But look, God imposed limits. All that he has is in your power. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. Job 1:12. That is, even in trials, God remains in control. This is sovereignty, and this should generate humility in us and faith. So if you are living in a time of pain, loss, desert, maybe, it's time to stop asking why and start asking why. Because some of the battles you face aren't just about you. They are about something much bigger, and His name may be echoing in the sky. Your life may be serving as an answer to the accuser. When you choose to worship even without understanding, you're saying, my faith doesn't depend on what I have, but on who He is. That's integrity in action. This is righteousness in the midst of trial. And another thing, remember that it all started because God trusted Job. He trusted so much that He gave His name as an example. It makes me wonder, would God trust me like that? On you? It's chilling just to imagine, but at the same time, it's inspiring. Because if God allows the fight, it's because He knows you can handle it. Even if you doubt, He does not. And what comes after that? What comes after begins to shape something even deeper. And that's it. That's where the most painful and real part of the story comes in. Because after the enemy receives permission, what happens to Job is not light. It's loss after loss, blow after blow. But before I tell you that, I need to show you what Job does when everything starts to fall apart. Because his attitude at that moment changes everything. Job, covered with sores from head to foot, sitting on a heap of ashes, scraping his own body with a piece of tile, and all that in silence, a deafening silence. The dead children, the possessions finished, health destroyed, the soul in pieces. And do you know what weighs the most? God does not respond. Not a word, no vision, no relief, only emptiness. And in this emptiness, Job begins to cry out with words, full of pain. Why was I born if I was to suffer like this? Job 3:11. It is in this part of the story that most people see themselves. Job's pain at this point is no longer just physical, it is existential. It's that kind of pain that takes your breath away and makes the soul wither. And the sky apparently remains silent. Have you ever been there? He has prayed for days, weeks, months, and silence was all he received. There's nothing more distressing than feeling like you're talking to the walls. But believe me, even God's silence has a purpose. And Job, even without knowing it, was being transformed from within. Notice what he says. Groanings that I fear come upon me, and what I fear happens to me. I have no peace, no rest, no quiet, only restlessness. Job 3:25-26. Look at the honesty of that. Job does not hide his pain. He does not disguise his anguish. He tears the soul before God. This is faith too, because faith is not just singing when everything is going well. Faith is to keep crying out when the sky seems mute. Faith is knocking on the door, even without hearing footsteps on the other side. Faith is trusting in presence, even without hearing the voice. And you know what impresses you the most? Job never curses God. He regrets it, he cries, he questions. But he does not abandon his reverence. This reveals an integrity that goes beyond logic, because God's silence is not absence, it's training. It is in silence that faith is strengthened. It is in the dark that spiritual eyes are opened. God was silent, but it was not far away. Behold, God is great, and we understand him not. Job 36:26. His sovereignty does not depend on our understanding. This is where many people give up, because we are used to quick responses with immediate solutions. But with God, time is different, and the process is more important than the relief. Job was being refined, like gold in fire. Without even realizing it, his faith was growing, and with each cry, his soul was polished. Even if he kill me, I will hope in him. Job 13:15. This statement It is one of the strongest in the Bible. Whoever says this has no common faith. He has living faith. Now tell me, could you keep this hope in the midst of silence? Because silence tests integrity more than any suffering. When all else fails and the sky is mute, who do you become? Job did not become a rebel. He became an intercessor in training, because even in his laments, he was drawing closer to God. This is transformation. This is pain with purpose. And it is at this moment that he begins to desire something deeper, a bridge, a mediator, someone who understands him and takes his cry to God. This cry for a mediator is like a prophetic echo of what would come much later. Job says, "If only there was someone to arbitrate between us, to lay his hand on both of us, on me and on God." Job 9:33. Do you see what is being born here? A glimpse of the Redeemer. Even in suffering, even in silence, hope does not die. Job did not know the name of Jesus, but he already longed for the bridge that he would become. This is anticipatory faith. It is living hope. And it is then, at the height of pain and the absence of answers, that something begins to change within Job. He still has no explanations, but it is already moving towards revelation. And in the midst of this cutting silence, his heart begins to realize that not everything needs to be understood, to be lived. Because when we don't have God's words, we have to learn to listen to His presence. And it is from this apparent absence that the next part of this story springs up, the one that will surprise us. Let me tell you something that few have the courage to admit. Not all pain comes because of a mistake. Sometimes suffering appears in the lives of the righteous, the upright, the righteous, simply because, yes, this was the case with Job. He was an upright man. He had nothing to hide. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, a man of integrity and uprightness, fearing God and shunning evil. Job 1:1. Even so, he was cast into the abyss of suffering. This breaks that old idea that if you suffer, it's because you deserve it. That you are going through a trial is because you have sinned, not always. And here we need to be honest. How many times have we heard, or even said, that someone's suffering was the consequence of some hidden flaw? Job deconstructs this. He was fair, and even so he lost everything. This shows that pain does not only choose who makes mistakes. Sometimes it comes precisely to those who are walking the line. And as strange as it may seem, there is beauty in this mystery, because it is in this apparently unfair pain that some of the most profound transformations are born. Suffering that has no explanation becomes fertile soil for faith without reservations. There are times when God allows pain not to correct us, but to expand us. It is as if He said, "You are already righteous. Now I want to make you deep." And this requires silence, it requires solitude, it requires surrender. Job asked, "Why have these disasters befallen me if I have not committed iniquity?" Job 6:24-25. And God at that moment remained silent, but not by absence, but by strategy. Because not every answer is given with words. Sometimes the answer is His presence in the midst of chaos. It is the hope that lives on even without understanding it. You know, when you see someone going through something difficult and you think, "Wow, he's so good, he didn't deserve this." So, this phrase comes from the misconception that suffering is always punishment. But in the kingdom, pain can also be stoning. And look at what is written. God tries the righteous. Psalm 11:5. He does not abandon, He proves it. It shapes. And this should generate humility in us, because suffering puts us all on the same level, poor and rich, wise and simple, all dependent on grace. It is in this pain that true transformation happens. The interesting thing is that instead of Job rebelling, he continues to seek. Even without understanding, even in regret, even wounded, it persists. And this is faith in its raw state. Faith that does not negotiate with fear. Faith that does not hide from pain. Faith that says, though I see not the Redeemer, I know that he lives. Job 19:25. It is this certainty that keeps Job breathing. He doesn't rely on answers. He rests on a conviction. God continues to be just, even when everything seems the opposite. Maybe you're going through something that doesn't make sense, a pain that has no name, a loss that has no logic, and the people around them even try to help, but they only manage to get worse, with those ready-made phrases, those mechanical prayers. The story of Job gives you permission to feel, to regret, to question, because real faith is not only made of beautiful statements, it is made of daily delivery, even in pieces. Job teaches us that integrity resists even meaninglessness. And there's more. It was at the height of pain that Job made one of the most profound statements in the entire book. He said, though he slay me, I will hope in him. Job 13-15. Think about it. Job wasn't asking for blessings. He just wanted meaning. I wanted to know if there was still purpose in the pain. But even without finding it, he chose to stay. This is trust in divine sovereignty. This is living hope in the midst of ruin, because if there's one thing that suffering teaches us, it's reverence. The awareness that God continues to be God, even when nothing makes sense. And it is from this reverence, this silence interspersed with sighs, that Job begins to face another type of trial, one that comes from where he least expected it, from friends. Those who should embrace begin to accuse. And then, my friend, the story enters a new chapter, one that shows that sometimes those who hurt the most, it's the one who thinks it's helping. Now listen to me calmly, because this part of the story is one of those that hurts deeply. Job, destroyed, alone, full of wounds. And finally, friends show up. 3 to be exact, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They arrive, they see his situation, and for 7 days they just stay there, in silence. It seemed like it was going to be a consolation, a gesture of empathy, but then they open their mouths, and that's it. What was supposed to be comfort becomes judgment. It is as if they were saying, Job, confess at once. No one suffers like that for nothing. Job 4:7-8. But the question that remains is, who gave them the authority to say this? Eliphaz begins with that spiritualized tone. Affliction does not spring from the dust, neither does pain spring up from the ground. Job 5:6. In other words, if you are suffering, it is because you have planted something wrong. Look at the twisted logic. If the pain is present, then it's your fault. Bildad and Zophar follow the same line. They begin to cite theology, divine justice, laws of cause and effect. But they forget to look into Job's heart. They don't ask, they don't cry with him, they only accuse. Job then says with tears in his voice, "Poor comforters are you all." Job 16:2. What a blow. This is where many people identify themselves. Because when the pain tightens, instead of support comes judgment. You prayed little. This is God's discipline. Some sin you have hidden. And we, broken inside, still have to deal with pointed fingers. But Job's story makes it clear. The friends were wrong. God himself confirms this later. You did not speak what was right about me, as my servant Job did. Job 42:7. What they said seemed right, but it was empty of truth. It was a speech without discernment, and this hurts more than it heals. There's a lesson here, see? Not every spiritual opinion is inspired by God. Sometimes the most spiritual thing anyone can do is just sit next to them, listen, and cry together. Integrity is not knowing how to answer everything. It is knowing how to be silent when you don't understand. Reverence is also silence. The friends made a mistake because they wanted to explain the inexplicable. They turned mystery into judgment, and they lost the chance to be arms of the Redeemer at that moment. How many times do we do this without realizing it? Have you ever seen when someone is in crisis and receives more pressure than consolation? This is common and dangerous because that kills hope. Job began to feel even more alone. He says, "My brothers have turned away from me, and even those who knew me have forgotten." Job 19:13. The pain of loneliness grows when those who are supposed to sustain abandon. Job needed no explanation. He needed presence, and this is a precious lesson. Not all pain requires a response. Sometimes it just needs to be divided. The beautiful thing is that Job does not retaliate with hatred. He responds with a cry. He tries to argue, defend himself, seek meaning, but he never curses them. That's integrity. Even though he is unjustly hurt, he preserves his faith, his humility, and this posture is being polished in the eyes of heaven. Suffering does not corrupt you. On the contrary, it strengthens, because it does not rest on the opinion of men, but on the sovereignty of God. I know that my Redeemer lives. Job 19:25. Job still believes, even without understanding. And look at the divine irony. Later on, the very friends who judged will depend on Job's prayer. This shows how God reverses positions. Who judges you today? Tomorrow, it may depend on your intercession. Because in the kingdom, what counts is not the appearance, it is the heart. Job kept his clean, even wounded. That's it. That moves the sky. Because forgiveness in the midst of pain has an eternal weight, and what seemed like injustice, it begins to become a restaurant platform. But before that comes something even deeper. Job begins to express a thirst, a need to have someone who speaks to God for him, a mediator, an intercessor. And that's when, in the midst of suffering, Job gets a prophetic glimpse of something that would change the entire world, the bridge between heaven and earth. The longing for a living Redeemer begins to spring up in the midst of the lament. Imagine the scene. Job, wounded inside and out after hearing judgments from his friends, raises his eyes to heaven and begins to desire something that had never been said so clearly until then. He says, "Oh, that there was an arbiter among us who could lay his hand on both of us, on me and on God." Job 9:33. Look at the depth of this. Job is crying out for a mediator, someone who understands you, who understands your pain and still has access to the heavenly throne. He didn't want a judge. He wanted an intercessor. And that, friend, is much more than a prayer. It's a living prophecy. It is as if there, in the midst of suffering, Job's heart had glimpsed something that not even the theology of the time understood. Because, think with me, until then God was seen as an absolutely distant, inaccessible, feared being. But Job, in the depths of his pain, has the audacity to ask for a link, a bridge, a representative who is a man like him, but also has free access to the divine. Is it or isn't it the perfect portrait of Jesus? For there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. 1 Timothy 2:5. This statement by Job messes with the spiritual structure of the story. It shows that even without knowing the name, he longed for the coming of the Redeemer. Job was in the Old Testament, but his cry spanned centuries and pointed straight to the New. And this teaches us a beautiful thing. The Holy Spirit acts even when understanding has not yet attained. Job was not being theological, he was being sincere. He felt he needed someone who understood human pain, and at the same time, to know the justice of God. Sometimes we also feel like that, right? Alone, misunderstood, disconnected from God. And the heart cries out for someone to intercede for us, to translate our tears, to take our groans to heaven. That is why the Bible says, "The Spirit intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words." Romans 8:26. Job didn't have that verse to read, but his heart already knew. I was already looking forward to it. I was already looking for it. His faith was so alive that he broke through the limitations of time and saw the hope that was yet to come. This reveals a powerful truth. Suffering, when experienced with humility and reverence, sharpens the ears of the soul. It makes us desire not answers, but relationship. Job didn't just want to know the why. He wanted someone who would be with him in the midst of pain. And that's exactly what Christ represents. He is the mediator who enters the fire with us. It doesn't explain the pain right away, but shares it, and that changes everything, because God's presence is worth more than any explanation. You see, Job does not deny God's sovereignty. He just wants to be heard. He says, "Though I cried, and he answered me, I would not believe that he should heed me." Job 9:16. You can feel the tiredness, the pain, the desire to be understood. How many times do we also feel this way? But even exhausted, Job does not lose faith. He keeps crying out, keep waiting, because deep down he knew, if there is justice, one day the just one would hear his lament. This is living hope in the midst of trial, and this hope, when planted in a field of pain, grows strong, because it does not depend on emotions, but on conviction. Job was literally saying, I need someone to go for me. This is too prophetic. This is a cry of faith. And if you are going through something that no one understands, know this same mediator that Job dreamed of today is available. We have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous, the 1 John 2:1. He is real. He doesn't just understand pain. He has already carried it. And it is at this point that Job begins to declare something even bolder, something that is born of this desire for a mediator, for an intercessor, something that would echo for centuries, until today. Job looks beyond the smoke, beyond the losses, beyond the wounds, and says with all his soul, I know that my Redeemer liveth. But that part needs to be told calmly, because it's one of the greatest statements of faith in the entire Bible. There are things that we can only say when the soul is at the limit. And it was exactly at this point that Job arrived. Amid ashes, wounds, mourning, and silence, he opens his mouth and says one of the most powerful phrases in biblical history. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he will rise at last on the earth. Job 19:25. Notice that sentence. He didn't say, I think, nor I wait. He said, I know, an unshakable certainty, even without having proof, even without consolation, even without an answer. This is real faith. This is hope anchored in eternity. And he says this in one of the darkest chapters of his journey. Job had just described how everyone had abandoned him, friends, brothers, servants, even his own wife. The pain was so deep that he even said, my bones cling to my skin and my flesh, and I escaped with only the skin of my teeth. Job 19:20. Still, in the midst of all this, he looks beyond, in addition to pain, in addition to meat, beyond logic, and he finds a Redeemer. This, my friend, is transformation. That's when pain doesn't kill, she reveals. Interestingly, Job uses the word Redeemer. It's in Hebrew the term is Goel, which means one who rescues, who pays the price, who buys someone's freedom. And that points directly to Jesus. Even without knowing the name, Job already envisioned the mission. He believed that there was someone capable of restoring all that was lost, one who would one day rise, not only spiritually but physically, and bring justice. After this skin of mine is consumed, yet in my flesh shall I see God. Job 19:26. What a powerful vision. Can you imagine the strength of this conviction? Job didn't even know if he would live another day, but he believed that he would see God with his own eyes. I will see it for myself. My eyes will see it, and not others. Job 19:27. This is intimacy. This is faith with identity. He didn't expect anyone to tell him about God. He wanted to see it, touch. Job didn't want an explanation. He wanted a presence. He wanted the Lord of life, not just an end to pain. This is the essence of true faith, to desire the Redeemer above restoration itself. And this is where the story becomes personal to us, because how many times do we want miracles more than the God who works miracles? Job teaches us the opposite. He wanted to see the Redeemer, even if it was after death. He preferred God's presence to the return of his possessions. This is spiritual maturity. This is knowing what really matters. And when we understand that, our prayer changes. It goes from "Lord, take away my pain" to "Lord, be with me in it." There's something about this statement of Job that moves heaven, because when a broken heart decides to worship, God manifests himself. When the ruined soul declares that the Redeemer lives, the heavens open. Job did not yet see the end of his struggle, but he already saw what mattered most: God's sovereignty, eternal justice, the promise of redemption. This teaches us that true faith does not depend on the now. She looks forward. It relies on God's character, not on circumstances. Maybe you're living something that seems endless. Maybe your days are heavy and your eyes can't see the way out. But Job is living proof that it is possible to maintain hope, not an illusory hope based on fantasy, but a solid hope, grounded in who God is. For with God nothing is impossible. Luke 1:37. The Redeemer whom Job saw from a distance, we know today by name. And he is still alive. He keeps getting up. He keeps redeeming. And it is precisely at this point in the story that something begins to change. Not yet visibly, not yet materially, but inside, Job's spirit begins to align with eternity. And that's it, exactly there, that God's silence gives rise to something extraordinary, because the living Redeemer begins to move toward the answer. After so many chapters of silence, so many unanswered questions, so many cries that seem to disappear in the wind, God finally speaks. But pay attention to this. It does not appear as a whisper, nor as a gentle breeze. God comes in a whirlwind. Then the Lord answered Job out of a whirlwind. Job 38:1. It's almost as if heaven says, the time has come. But surprisingly, he does not come to give explanations. It does not provide a list of reasons. He simply reveals who he is. And that changes everything. What God does there is disconcerting. He begins to question Job. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Job 38:4. He speaks of the stars, the seas, the skies, the animals, the seasons. God takes Job on a tour of creation, not to humiliate him, but to show the vastness of his sovereignty. He does not answer the why of the pain, but reveals the who is above all. It's as if to say, you don't have to understand. You need to trust. That's it. It is reverence in its pure state. This kind of revelation is like a light on in a dark room. Suddenly, Job realizes that his pain, as great as it is within a much broader plan. God did not lose control at any time. He has always been in charge, including the whirlwind. The Lord has set the north over the void, suspend the earth over nothing. Job 26:7. The same God who sustains the universe. He is there before, a wounded man revealing his glory. And this presence is worth 1,000 explanations. Sometimes we think we need answers to rest. But the story of Job shows that what we really need is God's presence, because presence calms what reason cannot resolve. Job was waiting for words, but he received something bigger, a meeting. And this encounter did not come with theological arguments or logical explanations. He came with questions that generated humility. It came with the reminder that God is God and we are dust. That doesn't diminish us. This positions us. That is why Job responds the way he does. I am unworthy. What would I answer you? I put my hand over my mouth. Job 44. And then, I knew you just by hearing, but now my eyes see you. Job 42:5. This is too strong, because Job realizes that pain has not taken him away from God. She brought him closer. It didn't destroy him, transformed it. The silence, the lament, the trial were the path to a revelation he would never have had otherwise. This is mature faith. This is transformation. If there's one thing this part of the story teaches us, it's that not all suffering needs to be understood to be valuable. Sometimes pain is just the way to a deeper vision of who God is, and God reveals himself when we least expect it, not to give us a report, but to give us a presence. And this presence changes everything. Job had an encounter with divine sovereignty. In the midst of the storm, what about you? Have you allowed God to speak to you in the midst of the whirlwind of your life? Perhaps today what you need is not an explanation, but an encounter. Maybe the whirlwind around you isn't chaos, but the announcement that God is about to speak. And he still speaks, not always with audible words, but with signs, with peace, with presence, with hope. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. The invitation is not to understand everything, it's to trust those who govern everything, and that in itself begins to restore the soul. And when the soul begins to be restored, something inside us changes. Complaints turn into prayer, doubts turn into worship, pride turns into regret. And it is precisely in this inner turn that Job begins to experience the greatest transformation of his life, a transformation that does not start from the outside, but inside. When God finishes speaking of the whirlwind, the silence that follows is different. Now it is no longer the silence of doubt, but of surrender. Job hears all of that, about the sea God has measured with his hands, about the constellations he has lined up, about the animals he sustains, and he finally understands you can't argue with the Creator. The only possible response is to bow down. That is why he says, "My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes see you." That is why I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job 42:5-6. Right. It is true humility, but pay attention to one detail. Job is not repenting of hidden sins. He is regretting having spoken of what he did not understand. He felt he could demand explanations from God. But now, he is silent. He puts his hand in his mouth. He surrenders. And this teaches us something powerful. Repentance is not just about sin. It's about recognizing that God is bigger than our arguments, that he is just, even when he seems absent, that he is sovereign, even when we don't understand his decisions. This posture of Job is what transforms everything, because God does not reject a broken heart. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. Oh, God, you shall not despise. Psalm 51:17. And here we see that true justice is not in self-defense, but in surrender. Job stops trying to understand and begins to trust. He drops his pride, lets go of his control, and throws himself into the arms of the Redeemer. That's it. It moves the heart of God. This is where a lot of people stumble, because he confuses regret with weakness. But in fact, only the strong truly repent. Only those who have integrity are able to look at themselves and say, I said too much. I questioned what I didn't understand. I surrender. Job did not become an atheist. He did not become cynical. He did not rebel. He broke inside. And therefore, it was rebuilt by God. The transformation begins on the ground. It is in dust and ashes that true faith flourishes. Have you ever experienced this kind of regret? Not the forced one for fear of punishment, but the one that is born from the encounter with the greatness of God. The one who says, Lord, I don't understand everything, but I trust in you. This is the kind of faith that brings about restoration, that cleanses the soul, that removes invisible wounds, and that prepares the way for something new. Humility opens doors that pride keeps closed. Job humbled himself, and that's what changed the course of his story. And God, being just, responds to this attitude, but not as we would expect. He does not deliver immediate blessings. First, he changes perspective. First, he restores from within, because before the material restitution comes spiritual reconstruction. Job was molded by fire, and now he is ready to live what he never imagined. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. James 4:6. And Job, now humble, becomes the kind of person God exalts, not for possessions, but for refined faith. The most beautiful thing about all of this is to realize that Job never stopped talking to God. Even when I was angry, confused, broken, he always prayed, he always sought. And that made all the difference. Because those who continue to talk to God, even without an answer, end up finding more than explanations. He ends up finding God himself, and when that happens, everything changes. Pain becomes seed, silence turns into wisdom, and repentance becomes a portal for restoration. And that's exactly what is starting to happen. When Job's heart bows, the sky begins to move, and God's answer comes not only in words, but in attitude. An attitude that not only restores Job, but also transforms the fate of those who hurt him. But this part you need to listen to carefully. Now hold this part with affection in your heart, because it's not just about blessing, it's about redemption. After all the suffering, silence, and repentance, God moves. But notice the detail. The turning point in Job's life does not happen when he cries out for himself. The restoration begins when he prays for his friends. The Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends, and the Lord added twice as much as Job once had. Job 42:10. This is the spiritual key. Forgiveness opens doors that not even the deepest regret can open. Think about it. Job's friends judged him, hurt him, spoke unwisely, and yet he intercedes for them, not because they deserved it, but because Job was transformed. His integrity is now compassionate. The pain made him deeper, not more bitter. This is faith in the form of action. And when he prays with a clean heart, without sorrows, the sky moves. This shows that true restoration is not just about getting back. It is to have the heart aligned with the justice and mercy of God. And then, yes, the material blessings return, but not in the same way. They come folded. And so the Lord blessed the last state of Job more than the first. Job 42:12. He had twice as many sheep, oxen, servants. He had sons and daughters again. But something is even deeper here. Job doesn't just get back what he lost. He becomes another man. He is now more sensitive, wiser, more surrendered. He didn't go back to what he was. He went further. And this is what God does with those who remain faithful in trial. The blessing is beautiful, but the most valuable thing was what was born within him. Job had a vision that few have. He saw God's sovereignty with the eyes of the soul. He learned that faith is not based on protection, but on presence. That's it. No one can take it away. Now, he doesn't just talk about God, he talks to God with intimacy. The test did not take away his faith. She revealed her faith. And it was precisely this that set the stage for the complete restoration. Job was not only a blessed man, he was a man marked by the sky. This makes me think about how many times we ask for restitution, but still carry sorrows, pride, self-defense. Job teaches us that blessing does not begin on the outside. It starts in the heart. Prayer for those who hurt us, surrender before God, reverence in the midst of chaos. All of this paves the way. And when God sees a heart like that, it doesn't just restore, it multiplies. I will restore the years that were consumed by the locust. Joel 2:25. And he does it his way, at the right time. And it is interesting that Job had beautiful daughters and placed them on an equal footing with the sons in the inheritance. Something rare for that time. This shows how much he has been transformed. He didn't just get more, he started to live differently, with more compassion, with more justice, with more wisdom. The pain generated empathy, the lament became a legacy, and hope, which seemed dead, blossomed in the form of new life. This is true restoration, when what comes back with purpose. You know, God could have restored Job in the beginning, but he waited, because more important than giving everything back, it was to form something eternal within him. And that's what he wants to do with us too. He doesn't just want to give us things, he wants to shape us, because true wealth is not what you have, but who you become after the fire. Job went through the trial, and he left with integrity, hope, reverence, faith, and a heart ready to intercede. This is a legacy that goes beyond time. But before we get too excited about the reward, there's something even more surprising that happens. Because those same friends who accused him are now placed before God and receive an unusual order, one that reveals the most glorious turn in history. Now hold this scene, because it is, to say the least, surprising. Those three friends who pointed the finger, accused, humiliated, now they are being confronted by God. That's right, the Lord himself, the one who was silent for so many chapters, now looks at Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and says, "My anger is kindled against you, because you did not speak of me what was right, as my servant Job did." Job 42:7. Look at the divine irony. Those who thought they were the spirituals, now they need the intercession of those they thought were wrong, and it doesn't stop there. God doesn't just rebuke the friends, he puts their restoration in Job's hands. "Take therefore 7 bullocks and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer burnt offerings for yourselves, and my servant Job will pray for you, for I will accept his intercession." Job 42:8. In other words, you will only be forgiven if he prays for you. This is a divine lesson in humility. The one who has been wounded is now the channel of forgiveness. God turns the tables, not out of revenge, but to teach a lesson in justice and grace. Imagine the impact of this on friends. They must have swallowed hard. The same Job they accused of sin, now he was the only one who could intercede for them. This shows that God does not forget how you are treated. He sees, he listens, and he honors the faithful. Whoever touches you touches the apple of my eye. Zechariah 2:8. Job, with a clean heart, does not hesitate. He prays, he forgives, he intercedes. This is spiritual maturity. That's integrity in action. This is the lordship of Christ working in someone even before the cross. And there's a powerful secret here. God didn't restore Job before that prayer. It was after that he prayed for his friends. The restitution happened when he released forgiveness. This teaches us that sometimes the key to the turning point in our life is not in crying out for justice, but in offering grace. It is when we put our pride aside and choose the path of reconciliation, even if it hurts, even if the other doesn't deserve it. Because who forgives frees himself, and who intercedes for the one who hurt him, it touches the heart of God. This kind of divine inversion happens more often in the Bible. Joseph, who was sold by his brothers, is then the one who feeds them. Moses, rejected by the people, is then the one who intercedes for them before God. Jesus, unjustly crucified, cries out, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Luke 23:34. The kingdom of God does not follow human logic. He exalts the humiliated. He honors the broken. and he uses them that have been trodden down to raise others. That's grace in motion, and the story of Job shows us that spiritual authority does not come from titles nor from arguments, but of brokenness. Job was elevated because he surrendered, because even though he was injured, he continued to trust. And when the time was right, God honored him. He who was publicly humiliated is now publicly exalted. Those who used to point the finger now lower their heads. And this teaches us that God doesn't just restore, it also adjusts. He also corrects. And he is righteous in all his ways. But notice, Job does not take revenge. He doesn't throw it in his face. He does not exalt himself. He simply obeys. He prays. He fulfills the role of intercessor with reverence. Because now he knows who God is. And when we know who God is, you don't need to prove anything else to anyone. This is maturity. It is when the heart is so full of presence that there is no room left for resentment. Job is now a bridge, not a barrier. It is a channel of restoration, not retaliation. And it is in this spirit of maturity, faith, forgiveness, and reverence that the story of Job begins to close. But there is still one last revelation, something that doesn't come in words, but in such a deep presence that it becomes a sufficient response to everything that has been experienced. We have reached a point in history where many people would expect great explanations, a detailed revelation of why it all happened. But God, He doesn't act as we expect. He does not deliver a heavenly report nor a map of motives. Instead, He offers something greater, His presence, and for those with sensitive hearts, this is more than enough. Job was waiting for answers, but he received God Himself, and at the end of the day, this is worth infinitely more. You encircle me behind and in front of me, and put your hand on me. Psalm 139:5. Do you know what's strong in all this? It's just that Job stops asking questions. After the whirlwind, after the revelation, after the touch of the eternal, he is silent, because God's presence solves what human arguments can't reach. The soul, when it meets the Creator, understands that it does not need to understand everything. This is what happens when faith matures. The lamentation ceases, the cry turns into reverence, and reverence turns into peace. God's presence, by itself, answers without saying a word. How many times do we look for explanations when in fact what we need most is presence? Pain screams, fear tightens, doubt suffocates, and all we ask is, God, speak to me. But often He answers with silence. But this silence, when charged with His presence, heals, turns, restores. In thy presence there is a fullness of joy. At your right hand there are pleasures forever. Psalm 16:11. It's not about understanding why, it's about knowing who's with us while it's all happening. Job did not receive a thesis on suffering, he was given a date, and that, my friend, changes anyone's life. Because one experience with God's presence is worth 1,000 sermons. It's as if, in the end, God is saying, you don't need the answers, you need me. And it's true. Faith that matures learns to trust even without explanations. Learn to walk even without a map. Learn to rest even in the midst of the whirlwind. This is what makes Job's faith so impressive. Because she was not sustained by blessings, it was sustained by presence. He began the story by knowing God from hearsay, but he ended by saying, now my eyes see you. Job 42:5. And when we see God for real, not with the eyes of the body, but with those of the soul, everything changes. Suffering loses its weight. Pain finds purpose. Life gains direction, and the heart finds rest. Maybe that's what you're needing right now. Not an immediate miracle nor a logical answer, but simply the presence of God, that peace that invades without asking permission. that certainty that settles in the midst of uncertainty, that hope that ignites even in the dark. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted. Psalm 34:18. He doesn't explain, he approaches, and this approach changes the mood of the soul. Job is proof of this, and when we understand that God's presence is the greatest answer there is, life changes course. The focus is no longer to get out of the pain, but to remain with God within it. Because when he is near, even the valley has meaning, even the ashes have hope, even silence has a voice. Job discovered this, and this discovery led him to peace. True peace does not come from the absence of problems. It comes from the certainty that the Redeemer walks with us, even when all seems lost. And it is with this understanding that Job's story nears its end, but not just any end. Throughout the narrative, we see how Job's suffering transforms even the way he sees life. Before, everything was right. It all made sense. But now, he understands that pain does not obey formulas, that there are trials that come without explanation, and that God's sovereignty does not fit in our spiritual spreadsheets. This changes the way he relates to God, and it changes the way he sees the other. Who is this that darkeneth counsel without understanding? Job 38:2. It is at this point that the book becomes a mirror of the soul, and the transformation is so real that when Job listens to God's voice, he doesn't demand explanations. He surrenders. He breaks into silence. He repents, not for hidden sins, but for speaking of what he did not understand. How many of us would have that courage, this reverence, that integrity? Job shows that spiritual maturity is not knowing everything. It is to recognize that we know almost nothing, but still to trust. I knew you just by listening, but now my eyes see you. Job 42:5. This is transformation. That is why the book of Job is so topical. Because he doesn't answer everything. He reveals everything. It is not a manual, it is a mirror. It shows the impact of silence, the value of faith without guarantees, the beauty of a soul that continues to believe even in ashes. He shows what real life does to superficial theology, and what God does with those who surrender. Job ends up deeper, more human, wiser. The ordeal became a portal, the pain became a sanctuary. And do you know what is most impactful? God never explains why. He just appears, and his presence is enough. This teaches us that often what we need most is not an answer, it's a revelation. It is to feel that he is still there, that even when everything falls apart, he remains in control. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He protects those who trust in him, Nahum 1:7. And this presence is what changes everything. In the end, Job teaches us to look inward with honesty, to regret with faith, to endure with hope, to intercede with humility, to live with reverence, to trust in the Lord's sovereignty, even without understanding his ways. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest miracle of Job's story wasn't the restoration of things, but the restoration of the soul. And that's the point, where the spirit touches the deepest depths of human pain, that something extraordinary begins to happen. Job's story does not end in pain. She goes through pain. It shows that God's silence is not absence, it's a mystery. That true fidelity does not depend on rewards, but on relationships. That even when it all disappears, if God is still present, we still have it all. Job didn't come out with all the answers, but he left transformed, deeper, more broken, more whole than ever. He knew God from hearing about it. Now he knew, to see with his own eyes. I knew you just by listening, but now my eyes see you. Job 42:5. And maybe that's all that really matters. Because in the end, the real miracle was not material restitution. It was the rebirth of the soul, the fire that destroyed him. He also cleansed him. This story invites us to stop asking why and start asking what for. Because there are pains that don't make sense right now. but that prepare something eternal down the road. As it is written, "For our light affliction is working for us an eternal weight of very excellent glory." So 2 Corinthians 4:17. If you are going through a loss, a pain, a time of divine silence, know that Job also passed, and it remained, and it was transformed, and he saw God. Job's story is our story, the history of the faith that endures, of the pain that educates, of the fidelity that does not negotiate, of the soul that refuses to forsake God, even when all seems lost. So the next time it all falls apart, remember Job, and remember, God is still there. He still speaks, he still sees, it still restores, and sometimes he's closer in the ashes than in the palace. An end marked by something that sustains everything that came before, the strength of a living hope lit in the midst of pain. Because what Job experienced was not a punishment, it was a transformation, and what follows shows the real power of that hope. If there's one thing that can't be ignored in Job's story, it's hope. Not that superficial hope of ready-made phrases or cheap optimism, but a hope that survives mourning, loss, silence, and it is still there, breathing, even when everything else falls apart. At the height of despair, Job longed for death. Why is light given to the wretched and life to the bitter in spirit? Job 3:20. But even so, he did not abandon the faith. This is real hope. It is faith that insists on remaining, even when logic screams to give up. There are people who think that faith is the absence of doubts, but Job shows otherwise. He doubted, regretted, questioned, but he never let go of God's hand. That's courage. That's trust. This is knowing that even without answers, there is a Redeemer who lives. And it is this conviction that becomes the pillar of his resistance. Though he kill me, I will hope in him. Job 13:15. It is a hope that does not depend on the now, but on what is to come. Job did not expect an explanation. He hoped for a reunion with God. And that's what keeps us alive in the midst of pain, the hope that God is still writing history. That even when it seems to be an end, it is still a chapter. That even among ashes, life can sprout. That pain is not the last word. For to the righteous there ariseth light in darkness. Psalm 112:4. Job, even at rock bottom, could look up. And that, my friend, is what differentiates those who just survive of those who overcome. Because those who have hope have fuel to keep breathing even in the dark. Job's hope was not vague. She had a face. He had a name, even though he did not yet know it. Jesus, the mediator he longed for, the Redeemer he declared, the presence he felt. This shows that true hope is not a feeling, it is a person, and that person is Christ. Christ in you, the hope of glory. Colossians 1:27. Job had this glimpse, and that's what kept him standing, the certainty that in the end there would be justice, there would be redemption, there would be restoration. Maybe today you are living a moment like Job's, surrounded by losses, wounded by words, without the strength to go on. And all you have left is a thread of faith. But I tell you, this thread is enough. If you can still say, "Lord, help me," so there is still hope. Why art thou cast down, O my soul? Hope in God, for I will yet praise him. Psalm 42:11. Job shows us that the soul can weep, but hope does not have to die. She can be quiet, but he still lives. And you know what's more powerful? Job's hope not only sustained him, it has become a testimony for generations. To this day, thousands of years later, his story still strengthens hearts. This shows that our pain, when lived with faith, can bless other lives. It can become consolation, direction, and example. Job wasn't just restored, he was remembered, and not because of the suffering, but for the way he waited, for the way he continued to believe, even without guarantees. This hope that is born in the midst of pain is what sustains the saints, the prophets, the martyrs, the righteous. It is what moves the invisible world. It is what feeds prayers when the soul is exhausted. And it is what activates the heavens, because God cannot resist a heart that still believes in the midst of ashes. Job kept that flame alive, and it was she who lit the way to the restoration. Hope does not take away pain, but it gives meaning to it. It gives direction. It gives strength. And it is precisely this silent force, this flame that never goes out, that prepares us to understand something even deeper. Suffering, when lived with faith, not only proves who we are, it shapes who we become. And that's where we get to. The real impact of suffering, not as an end, but as the means to an eternal transformation. Suffering has a curious effect on the human soul. It reveals what was hidden, tears the veneer of appearances, and shows who we really are. In Job's case, suffering did not take him away from God. He brought him closer. Before the pain, he was upright, just, fearful. But after the pain, he was intimate. It is as if suffering had dug within him a space that only God's presence could fill. For when I am weak, then I am strong. 2 Corinthians 12:10. And this spiritual force, it is not born on sunny days. It is born in the midst of storms. You see, Job begins the book as an example of righteousness, but it ends up as a symbol of transformation. He wasn't just a man who endured pain, he was molded by it. And that's the true spiritual impact of suffering. It doesn't just test us, it forms us, it refines us, realigns us. Pain forces us to look inside, to face what we avoided, to let go of what we controlled. And when the soul surrenders, heaven manifests itself. Job was crushed, but in the end, it shone like gold. I have tried thee in the furnace of affliction. Isaiah 48:10. Pain, when lived with humility, becomes a school. It teaches us how to truly pray, to listen with the heart, to discern what matters. Job learned to forgive, trusting in silence, depending on the Redeemer. And all this did not come in a service, in a study, in a book, came amidst the ashes. That is why so many people who have experienced suffering carry a different authority, because it has marks that are not visible, but they are sacred. And anyone who has suffered with God knows he will never be the same again. Maybe today you look at yourself and only see shards, but shards in God's hand become stained glass windows. He puts the pieces together so that the light passes through them and shows something new. Job went through this process. He was broken, but every crack was filled with grace. He was wounded, but every scar became a living reminder of God's faithfulness. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are oppressed. In spirit, Psalm 34:18. God's presence is most visible when everything around him is gone. Suffering also increases empathy. Job, who may once have counseled from the height of plenty, now speaks with authority of pain. He knows the taste of tears, the weight of mourning, the silence of the soul, and that makes him more human, more affordable, more like Christ, who was tempted in all things like us, yet without sin. Hebrews 4:15. It is this kind of suffering that prepares us to comfort others, because only those who bled know how to stop someone's bleeding. The spiritual impact of pain is also in reverence. Job comes out of the experience not with answers, but with a new posture. He no longer questions as before. He bows, he loves it. And this is rare. Many people come out of bitter pain. But Job came out broken, transformed, with a washed soul. And that's a choice. Pain can harden you, or it can deepen you. Job chose to be deepened, and so God restored him, because he wastes no tears. And look how interesting, even after being restored, Job was never the same again. He did not return to the before. He started to live on a new level. This shows us that suffering, when lived in faith, does not return us to the starting point. It pushes us to a new level. Job was righteous before, but then he was intimate with God. And this type of relationship is only born where there was surrender. After this skin of mine is consumed, yet in my flesh shall I see God. Job 19:26. He didn't just survive the pain, he blossomed in it. And it is with this spiritual maturity, with this heart refined by trial, that Job delivers to us a powerful truth. Suffering does not have to be the end of history. It may be the beginning of something deeper, something that transforms not only our vision, but our very essence. And it is this mirror, this portrait of the human soul before the eternal, that leads us to the closing of this journey. A journey that is, in fact, the story of all of us. The book of Job is not just an ancient story. He is a mirror, a reflection of what happens inside every human being when life gives that unexpected thud. There we see the naked soul, broken, questioning, crying. It is as if the book revealed what religion hides, what pride disguises, and what the heart screams in the dark. Job is not just a character. He is us. It represents the human in the face of eternity, trying to understand why pain reaches even and those who have integrity, who fears the Lord among you, and walketh in darkness without light, trust in the name of the Lord. Isaiah 50:10. This book does not mask the pain, he dives into it. When Job laments, he is saying what many people feel but are afraid to say. Why was I born? Where is God? Is it worth continuing? It is an honest lament, raw, painful, but at the same time, full of faith. This is the most beautiful thing. Job does not give up on God, even when he does not understand him. And it is in this contrast that the book shows us the value of humility, of reverence even in confusion, of the faith that does not require logic but insists on remaining. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. Job 13:15. Only those who have cried on their knees understand this faith. The book also exposes our tendency to judge the other. Job's friends are the portrait of a religiosity without compassion. They speak with ready-made phrases, quick answers, without looking at the heart. How many times do we do this without realizing it? He uses the Bible as a hammer instead of a balm. Job teaches us that it is possible to be right and yet hurt, that words without empathy do not heal, and that justice without mercy is not justice, it is arrogance disguised as pity. An end marked by something that sustains everything that came before, the strength of a living hope lit in the midst of pain. Because what Job experienced was not a punishment, it was a transformation, and what follows shows the real power of that hope. If there's one thing that can't be ignored in Job's story, it's hope. Not that superficial hope of ready-made phrases or cheap optimism, but a hope that survives mourning, loss, silence, and it is still there, breathing, even when everything else falls apart. At the height of despair, Job longed for death. Why is light given to the wretched and life to the bitter in spirit? Job 3:20. But even so, he did not abandon the faith. This is real hope. It is faith that insists on remaining, even when logic screams to give up. There are people who think that faith is the absence of doubts, but Job shows otherwise. He doubted, regretted, questioned, but he never let go of God's hand. That's courage. That's trust. This is knowing that even without answers, there is a Redeemer who lives. And it is this conviction that becomes the pillar of his resistance. Though he kill me, I will hope in him. Job 13:15. It is a hope that does not depend on the now, but on what is to come. Job did not expect an explanation. He hoped for a reunion with God. And that's what keeps us alive in the midst of pain, the hope that God is still writing history. That even when it seems to be an end, it is still a chapter. That even among ashes, life can sprout. That pain is not the last word. For to the righteous there ariseth light in darkness. Psalm 112:4. Job, even at rock bottom, could look up. And that, my friend, is what differentiates those who just survive of those who overcome. Because those who have hope have fuel to keep breathing even in the dark. Job's hope was not vague. She had a face. He had a name, even though he did not yet know it. Jesus, the mediator he longed for, the Redeemer he declared, the presence he felt. This shows that true hope is not a feeling, it is a person, and that person is Christ. Christ in you, the hope of glory, Colossians 1:27. Job had this glimpse, and that's what kept him standing, the certainty that in the end there would be justice, there would be redemption, there would be restoration. Maybe today you are living a moment like Job's, surrounded by losses, wounded by words, without the strength to go on. And all you have left is a thread of faith. But I tell you, this thread is enough. If you can still say, Lord, help me, so there is still hope. Why art thou cast down, O my soul? Hope in God, for I will yet praise him. Psalm 42:11. Job shows us that the soul can weep, but hope does not have to die. She can be quiet, but he still lives. And you know what's more powerful? Job's hope not only sustained him, it has become a testimony for generations. To this day, thousands of years later, his story still strengthens hearts. This shows that our pain, when lived with faith, can bless other lives. It can become consolation, direction, and example. Job wasn't just restored, he was remembered, and not because of the suffering, but for the way he waited, for the way he continued to believe, even without guarantees. This hope that is born in the midst of pain is what sustains the saints, the prophets, the martyrs, the righteous. It is what moves the invisible world. It is what feeds prayers when the soul is exhausted. And it is what activates the heavens, because God cannot resist a heart that still believes in the midst of ashes. Job kept that flame alive, and it was she who lit the way to the restoration. Hope does not take away pain, but it gives meaning to it. It gives direction. It gives strength. And it is precisely this silent force, this flame that never goes out, that prepares us to understand something even deeper. Suffering, when lived with faith, not only proves who we are, it shapes who we become. And that's where we get to, the real impact of suffering, not as an end, but as the means to an eternal transformation. Suffering has a curious effect on the human soul. It reveals what was hidden, tears the veneer of appearances, and shows who we really are. In Job's case, suffering did not take him away from God. He brought him closer. Before the pain, he was upright, just fearful. But after the pain, he was intimate. It is as if suffering had dug within him a space that only God's presence could fill. For when I am weak, then I am strong. 2 Corinthians 12:10. And this spiritual force, it is not born on sunny days. It is born in the midst of storms. You see, Job begins the book as an example of righteousness, but it ends up as a symbol of transformation. He wasn't just a man who endured pain, he was molded by it. And that's the true spiritual impact of suffering. It doesn't just test us, it forms us, it refines us, realigns us. Pain forces us to look inside, to face what we avoided, to let go of what we controlled. And when the soul surrenders, heaven manifests itself. Job was crushed, but in the end, it shone like gold. I have tried thee in the furnace of affliction. Isaiah 48:10. Pain, when lived with humility, becomes a school. It teaches us how to truly pray, to listen with the heart, to discern what matters. Job learned to forgive, trusting in silence, depending on the Redeemer. And all this did not come in a service, in a study, in a book, came amidst the ashes. That is why so many people who have experienced suffering carry a different authority, because it has marks that are not visible, but they are sacred. And anyone who has suffered with God knows he will never be the same again. Maybe today you look at yourself and only see shards, but shards in God's hand become stained glass windows. He puts the pieces together so that the light passes through them and shows something new. Job went through this process. He was broken, but every crack was filled with grace. He was wounded, but every scar became a living reminder of God's faithfulness. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are oppressed. In spirit, Psalm 34:18, God's presence is most visible when everything around him is gone. Suffering also increases empathy. Job, who may once have counseled from the height of plenty, now speaks with authority of pain. He knows the taste of tears, the weight of mourning, the silence of the soul, and that makes him more human, more affordable, more like Christ, who was tempted in all things like us, yet without sin. Hebrews 4:15. It is this kind of suffering that prepares us to comfort others, because only those who bled know how to stop someone's bleeding. The spiritual impact of pain is also in reverence. Job comes out of the experience not with answers, but with a new posture. He no longer questions as before. He bows, he loves it. And this is rare. Many people come out of bitter pain. But Job came out broken, transformed, with a washed soul. And that's a choice. Pain can harden you, or it can deepen you. Job chose to be deepened, and so God restored him, because he wastes no tears. And look how interesting, even after being restored, Job was never the same again. He did not return to the before. He started to live on a new level. This shows us that suffering, when lived in faith, does not return us to the starting point. It pushes us to a new level. Job was righteous before, but then he was intimate with God. And this type of relationship is only born where there was surrender. After this skin of mine is consumed, yet in my flesh shall I see God. Job 19:26. He didn't just survive the pain, he blossomed in it. And it is with this spiritual maturity, with this heart refined by trial, that Job delivers to us a powerful truth. Suffering does not have to be the end of history. It may be the beginning of something deeper, something that transforms not only our vision, but our very essence. And it is this mirror, this portrait of the human soul before the eternal, that leads us to the closing of this journey. A journey that is, in fact, the story of all of us. The book of Job is not just an ancient story. He is a mirror, a reflection of what happens inside every human being when life gives that unexpected thud. There we see the naked soul, broken, questioning, crying. It is as if the book revealed what religion hides, what pride disguises, and what the heart screams in the dark. Job is not just a character. He is us. It represents the human in the face of eternity, trying to understand why pain reaches even and those who have integrity, who fears the Lord among you, and walketh in darkness without light, trust in the name of the Lord. Isaiah 50:10. This book does not mask the pain, he dives into it. When Job laments, he is saying what many people feel but are afraid to say. Why was I born? Where is God? Is it worth continuing? It is an honest lament, raw, painful, but at the same time, full of faith. This is the most beautiful thing. Job does not give up on God, even when he does not understand him. And it is in this contrast that the book shows us the value of humility, of reverence even in confusion, of the faith that does not require logic but insists on remaining. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. Job 13:15. Only those who have cried on their knees understand this faith. The book also exposes our tendency to judge the other. Job's friends are the portrait of a religiosity without compassion. They speak with ready-made phrases, quick answers, without looking at the heart. How many times do we do this without realizing it? He uses the Bible as a hammer instead of a balm. Job teaches us that it is possible to be right and yet hurt, that words without empathy do not heal, and that justice without mercy is not justice. It is arrogance disguised as pity.